Close your eyes. Let the day you have lived begin to loosen its hold on you, and let another day take its place. A day 2,000 years old, in a city that no longer exists in the form we are about to walk through, but whose echoes still shape the world you inhabit. We are going to Rome. Not the Rome of ruins and museum glass, not the Rome of postcards and guidebooks, but the Rome that breathed. The Rome that smelled of wood smoke and river water, of fresh bread and damp stone. The Rome where 1,000,000 human beings woke each morning in darkness and began, as you are now ending, another cycle of ordinary life. Listen, the city is still asleep. Almost. It is sometime in the early 2nd century of the Common Era. The Emperor Trajan, or perhaps Hadrian, rules from the Palatine Hill. And below that hill, sprawling across 7 famous ridges and the valleys between them, lies the largest city the ancient world has ever produced. 1,000,000 people. Consider that number. London would not reach such a population until the early 19th century, more than 1,700 years from now. Yet here, in an age of oil lamps and hand-ground flour, a city of that staggering scale already exists. It functions. It feeds itself. It wakes. The Tiber moves through the heart of it, slow and dark, carrying the mineral scent of the hills upstream and the faint sweetness of decay from the marshes to the south. In the hours before dawn, the river is a black ribbon, catching no light, reflecting nothing but the occasional flicker of a torch on one of the bridges. There are 8 bridges now, spanning the water at intervals, their stone arches sturdy enough that some will survive into your own century. The river divides the city, but also defines it. Everything flows toward it or away from it: water, sewage, commerce, memory. The Tiber is the oldest road in Rome. It was here before the hills had names. And those hills, the Palatine, the Aventine, the Caelian, the Esquiline, the Viminal, the Quirinal, the Capitoline, are not the dramatic peaks you might imagine. They are modest ridges, 60 to 150 feet above the valley floor, their slopes long since carved into terraces and buried beneath layers of construction. The wealthy have always preferred them. The air is better. The flooding cannot reach. But it is in the valleys between the hills and along the low ground near the river that the true density of Rome reveals itself. Here, packed along narrow, winding streets that follow paths laid down centuries before any emperor was born, rise the insulae. The insulae are Rome's answer to an impossible question. How do you house 1,000,000 people inside a circuit of walls? You build upward. These apartment blocks, constructed of concrete and timber and faced with brick, commonly reach 5, 6, even 7 stories. The ground floors are given over to shops, taverns, bakeries, the commercial life of the street. Above them, floor by floor, the apartments grow smaller, cheaper, more precarious. The wealthiest tenants live on the lower levels, where the ceilings are higher and the stairs are few. The poorest live at the top, in rooms with no running water, no heat, but what a portable brazier can offer, and walls so thin you can hear your neighbor turn in sleep. There are thousands of these buildings. Some scholars estimate tens of thousands. They define the skyline of Rome more than any temple or triumphal arch. This is not a city of marble. It is a city of brick and sweat and vertical ambition. Now listen again, because the sound is changing. It is perhaps the 4th hour before dawn, and from somewhere in the darkness comes a deep, wooden groan, the creak of axles, the scrape of iron-rimmed wheels against stone paving. A cart is moving through the streets. Then another. Then a dozen more, converging from every gate in the city walls, rolling down from the surrounding countryside with loads of timber, amphorae of wine and olive oil, baskets of vegetables, sacks of grain, blocks of travertine for a building project that will take another decade to complete. The sound is enormous. It fills the alleys and rebounds from the high walls of the insulae, a rumbling, clattering percussion that would make sleep nearly impossible for anyone living on a lower floor near a main road. And this is not an accident. This is policy. Julius Caesar, more than a century before our Roman morning, issued a decree known to scholars as part of the Lex Iulia Municipalis. Among its provisions was a restriction that shaped the soundscape of the city for generations. Most wheeled vehicles were banned from Rome's streets during daylight hours. The logic was practical. Rome's streets were narrow, many no wider than 15 feet, and during the day they thronged with pedestrians, merchants, enslaved workers, senators carried in litters, children, priests, beggars, soldiers on leave. Adding heavy cart traffic to that human river would have created paralysis. So the carts came at night. What no one standing in the Senate chamber that day may have fully appreciated was this: the decree did not eliminate the disruption of deliveries. It merely moved it into the hours when the city was supposed to be resting. The Roman satirist Juvenal, writing in the late 1st and early 2nd century, complained bitterly about the noise, claiming that the endless rumble of wagons through the streets was enough to rob even a deaf man of sleep. He was exaggerating, as satirists do, but only slightly. Imagine it now. You are lying on a thin mattress stuffed with wool or straw, on the 5th floor of an insula somewhere near the Subura, one of Rome's most densely populated neighborhoods. The walls around you are rough plaster, cool to the touch. There is no glass in the window, perhaps a wooden shutter, perhaps only a cloth, and through that opening comes the sound of the carts below, the occasional shout of a driver, the braying of a mule, the sharp crack of a whip. The air carries dust and the faint tang of animal dung. Somewhere nearby, a dog barks once and falls silent. Somewhere farther off, a rooster crows, confused by a lamp in a courtyard into believing the dawn has come early. You pull your cloak tighter. The wool is coarse against your skin, and you wait. This is the texture of Roman life that the monuments do not preserve. The marble columns and gilded temples tell us what Rome wanted to be remembered for. But the real city, the city of snoring neighbors and leaking roofs, of smoke-stained ceilings and the sound of 100 carts grinding through the darkness, that city can only be recovered in fragments. A line from a poet, a clause in a law, a scorch mark on a brick. Scholars have spent lifetimes piecing these fragments together, and what emerges is not a civilization of gods and heroes. It is a civilization of people, ordinary, tired, and so the city stirs. Not all at once, not with any grand announcement, but in the way that a million small awakenings ripple outward from the dark. A cough behind a wall, the scrape of a wooden shutter pushed open against pale grey light, the soft, padded footsteps of someone crossing a cold floor, arms wrapped tight around their chest, feeling their way toward the dim outline of a doorway. This is how Rome begins its day, not in marble halls, not beneath painted ceilings, but in the narrow, stacked apartments that house the vast majority of its people. Buildings called insulae, islands in the Latin, each one a world unto itself, rising 4, 5, sometimes 6 stories above the street, packed with families and laborers and freedmen and strangers who share walls thinner than a plank of oak. You would hear everything. You would smell everything. And on a winter morning, before the sun has cleared the eastern hills, You would feel the cold settle into your bones like something alive. This is where we begin. The insulae of Rome were, by any modern standard, remarkable feats of urban density. Scholars estimate that the city contained around 46,000 of these apartment blocks by the 4th century, compared to fewer than 2,000 single-family domus. The arithmetic is striking. Rome, at its height, held perhaps 1 million inhabitants, and the overwhelming majority of them lived not on the ground, but in the air, stacked above shops, above workshops, above the commercial life of the street. The ground floors were valuable. They faced the road. They had access to the city's water system, to the aqueduct-fed fountains and basins that served each neighborhood. But the higher you climbed, the less you had. The upper stories of a Roman insula had no running water whatsoever. If you lived on the 4th floor, you carried every drop you needed up a narrow wooden staircase from the fountain below. Every drop for drinking, every drop for cooking, every drop for washing your face in the grey half-light of morning. Water was weight, and weight was effort, and effort shaped the rhythm of the day before it had truly begun. The first task was the hardest. Imagine it now. You are lying on a low wooden bed, or perhaps a simple mattress stuffed with wool or straw, pushed against the wall of a room no larger than a modern bathroom. The ceiling is low. The plaster is cracked, and in places it has fallen away entirely, revealing the rough brick beneath. There is no glass in the window. Glass windows existed in Rome, yes, but they were luxuries found in wealthy homes and bathhouses, not here. Your window is a wooden shutter, and through its slats, the first thin blades of light are beginning to appear. The air is cold and faintly damp. If you are fortunate, there is a brazier in the corner, a portable metal basket filled with charcoal, and the remains of last night's fire still give off a low, ashy warmth that you can feel only if you hold your hand directly above it. This is your heating. This is all your heating. Rome's insulae had no chimneys, no flues, no central hearths. The charcoal smoke simply rose and lingered, drifting toward the ceiling, slipping out through the gaps in the shutters. Archaeologists have found soot deposits on the interior walls of excavated Roman apartments that speak to years, even decades, of this quiet accumulation. The air tasted of it. But there was another smell, one that arrived every morning like a promise. From the ground floor, from the tabernae that occupied the street-facing rooms of nearly every insula, came the warm, yeasty, unmistakable scent of baking bread. These ground-floor shops often housed pastrina bakeries, and their ovens were lit long before dawn. The bakers of Rome worked through the darkest hours, shaping loaves from grain that had been milled, in many cases, by donkeys turning heavy stone querns in the back of the shop. Bread was the foundation of the Roman diet, and for the urban poor, it was sometimes the whole of it. The poet Juvenal, writing in the early 2nd century, famously reduced the political desires of Rome's populace to 2 things, panem et circenses, bread and circuses. And while his tone was satirical, the centrality of bread was not. What no one realized at the time, perhaps, was how deeply that smell would embed itself in the archaeological record. Carbonized loaves have been recovered from the ruins of Pompeii, preserved in volcanic ash since the eruption of Vesuvius in 79 AD, their crusts still bearing the marks of the baker's scoring knife. One loaf, found in the oven of a man named Modestus, still carries his stamp. Bread survived. So you rise. You swing your legs over the side of the bed, and your feet meet the cold tile or wooden floor, and for a moment you simply sit, listening. The city is not quiet. Rome was never quiet. Through the thin partition wall to your left, you hear a child crying and a mother's low murmur. From below, the thud of a shutter being thrown open, the clatter of a merchant arranging his wares on a wooden counter. Somewhere not far, a dog barks twice and then stops. These sounds are layered, intimate, inescapable. Privacy, as we understand it, was not a feature of life in the insulae. The walls between apartments were often little more than wattle and daub, or thin brick partitions plastered over, and sound passed through them freely. The Roman poet Martial, who lived in a third-floor apartment in the late 1st century, complained bitterly in his epigrams about the noises that plagued him: the schoolteacher shouting lessons before dawn, the coppersmith hammering, the money changer rattling coins on his table. He wrote that Rome made it impossible to sleep and impossible to think. He stayed anyway. Everyone did. And yet there is something in this scene that deserves a second look, a detail that reframes the whole experience of Roman morning life. It concerns the light, or rather, the absence of it. The primary source of artificial illumination in a Roman home was the lucina, a small clay oil lamp fueled by olive oil, fitted with a wick of linen or papyrus. These lamps were ubiquitous. Archaeologists have recovered tens of thousands of them from sites across the empire, many beautifully decorated with images of gods, animals, and daily life. But they were dim, astonishingly dim. A single Roman oil lamp produced roughly the equivalent of 1 or 2 candles, enough to see your hand in front of your face, enough to find the water jug, but not enough to read by without strain, and certainly not enough to fill a room. This meant that for most Romans, the boundaries of the day were the boundaries of the sun. You rose with it. You worked by it. You returned home as it set. Artificial light extended the evening only slightly, and at a cost. Olive oil was not free, and in the upper floors of the insulae, every expenditure mattered. The dark was not merely an inconvenience. It was an economy. It was a calendar. So the morning routine was brisk, shaped by necessity and by the knowledge that daylight was a resource not to be wasted. You splashed your face with water from a clay basin, water you had carried upstairs the evening before, or that a household slave, if you were fortunate enough to have one, had fetched at first light from the neighborhood fountain. You pulled on your tunic, a simple garment of wool or linen that served as both underclothing and outerwear for the working classes. A belt cinched at the waist, leather sandals if you owned them, and then perhaps a piece of bread, yesterday's bread, torn and dipped in wine or olive oil, or a handful of olives or a few dried figs. Romans did not eat a large breakfast. The morning meal, called the intaculum, was modest and quick, often consumed standing. The real meal of the day, the cena, would come in the late afternoon, and everything before it was merely fuel for the hours ahead. There was much to do, and the sun was climbing. You step through the doorway of your apartment and into the narrow corridor. The light has barely touched the rooftops, and already the smell is rising. It drifts through the narrow streets of the suburra, curls between the shuttered windows of tenement blocks 5 and 6 stories tall, and settles over the city like a second dawn. It is the smell of baking bread. Warm, yeasty, faintly sweet, carrying with it the memory of wheat fields far away, in Sicily, in Egypt, in the golden plains of North Africa, where grain ships were loaded under a white Mediterranean sun. If you had stood on any street corner in Rome during the 1st or 2nd century of the Common Era, this is the smell that would have greeted you before anything else. Before the noise of cart wheels, before the shouts of vendors, before the city had fully remembered what it was. Bread came first. To understand Rome, you must understand grain. The city's survival depended on it with an urgency that is difficult to overstate. By the height of the empire, Rome held more than 1 million inhabitants, a concentration of human life unmatched in the Western world for over 1,000 years afterward. Feeding that population was not merely a logistical challenge. It was a political imperative, a matter of civic identity, and when the supply faltered, a cause of riots that could topple governments. The solution was the Annona Civica, a state-administered grain dole that distributed free grain to approximately 200,000 eligible Roman citizens. Not everyone qualified. You had to be male, a citizen, and registered on the rolls. But for those who were, the Annona was a lifeline, a monthly allotment of wheat that kept hunger at a manageable distance. Over time, the system evolved. By the reign of Aurelian in the 3rd century, the state began distributing not raw grain, but baked bread, loaves already prepared, handed out at designated points across the city. The emperor had decided that even the labor of grinding and baking was too great a burden to place on the poor. Rome would feed its people fully. Think about that for a moment. A government baking bread for its citizens. 200,000 mouths fed by the machinery of empire. The grain that made it possible had traveled extraordinary distances, across the sea from Alexandria, up the Tiber from Ostia on flat-bottomed barges, into warehouses so vast that their ruins still stand, half buried in the earth near the modern neighborhood of Testaxio. And what remains at Testaxio is itself a quiet wonder. Monte Testaxio, an artificial hill rising nearly 35 meters, composed entirely of broken amphorae, the clay vessels used to transport olive oil and other goods. Tens of millions of shattered pots, piled over centuries, forming a monument to the sheer volume of what Rome consumed. The city ate the world. But the day did not begin with feasts. For most Romans, breakfast was a modest affair. The meal was called the intaculum, taken shortly after rising, and it consisted of little more than bread, sometimes dipped in wine, sometimes accompanied by cheese, honey, or a handful of olives. There were no elaborate preparations, no long tables laid with silver. A worker might eat standing up, tearing a piece from a round loaf while pulling on his sandals. A mother might hand her children crusts softened in diluted wine, a drink the Romans called posca, which was common among soldiers and the poor alike. The simplicity of this meal tells us something important. Romans did not romanticize breakfast. The morning was for waking, for prayer at the household shrine, for stepping into the obligations of the day. Sustenance was necessary. Pleasure could wait. And yet here is a detail that reframes the whole picture, one that scholars sometimes pass over too quickly. The bread itself was not what we might imagine. Roman bread, particularly the panis plebeius distributed to the poor, was dense, dark, made from coarsely milled flour that retained much of the bran and germ. It was heavy in the hand. It was nutritious in a way that our modern white bread is not. And because Roman mills used stone grinding wheels, the bread contained tiny particles of gite, mineral fragments worn from the millstones themselves, which slowly, over a lifetime, ground down the teeth of everyone who ate it. Archaeologists studying Roman skulls have found this dental wear consistently, a silent signature of a civilization built on bread. Every loaf carried a cost. Now turn your attention from bread to water, and the story becomes, if anything, more astonishing. We take clean water for granted. We turn a tap and it flows, clear and cold, and we think nothing of the journey it has made. The Romans could not turn a tap, but what they built instead was one of the greatest engineering achievements in human history, a system so effective that parts of it still function today. By the 3rd century of the Common Era, 11 major aqueducts supplied the city of Rome with an estimated 200 million or more gallons of water every single day. 200 million gallons. For a city of roughly 1 million people, this represents a per capita supply that rivals or exceeds that of many modern cities. The water came from springs and streams in the hills surrounding Rome, some of it traveling more than 50 miles along channels built with a gradient so gentle, sometimes falling only a few inches per mile, that the engineering required to maintain it borders on the miraculous. The Romans did not have computers. They did not have laser levels. They had geometry, patience, and an unshakable conviction that their city deserved the finest water on earth. And so they built it. The aqueducts fed a vast network of public fountains, bathhouses, and private connections for the wealthy. Ordinary citizens drew their water from street-side fountains called lacus, which ran continuously, the overflow flushing the gutters and drains below. There was no mechanism to turn these fountains off. The water simply flowed day and night, a constant murmur threading through the streets of Rome like a quiet pulse. Sextus Julius Frontinus, who served as Curator Aquarum, the official in charge of Rome's water supply, around 97 CE, wrote a detailed treatise on the aqueducts that survives to this day. In it, he catalogued each aqueduct by name, measured its flow, and expressed a pride in the system that borders on reverence. He compared Rome's aqueducts favorably to the pyramids of Egypt, calling them evidence of true practical greatness. He was not wrong. And so the morning meal was taken. Bread in one hand, a cup of water or wine-diluted water in the other, and around you the sound of a city stirring into its full, noisy, magnificent life. The taste of coarse wheat on your tongue, the coolness of water that had traveled 50 miles through stone channels to reach your lips, the faint sweetness of honey, if you were fortunate enough to afford it, or the sharp bite of olive, salt-cured and dark. These were not luxuries. These were the ordinary textures of a Roman morning, simple, sustaining. The bread has been broken. The water has been drawn. And now, in the pale grey light that precedes the Roman dawn, something stirs in the narrow streets below the hills. It is not yet the chaos of the full morning. It is quieter than that, more purposeful, almost reverent. Figures move through the half-darkness, their sandals scraping against basalt paving stones, their togas freshly arranged, their faces set with a kind of practiced dignity. They are walking up hills. They are walking toward the grand houses on the Esquiline, the Caelian, the Palatine, toward the wide doorways of men more powerful than themselves. And they are not late, because in Rome, to be late for this particular ritual is to be forgotten. And to be forgotten is everything. This was the salutatio, the formal morning greeting that shaped the first hours of nearly every Roman day. It was, on its surface, a simple thing. A man of lower status, known as a client, would rise before dawn, dress in his toga, and walk to the home of his patron. There he would wait in the vestibule or the atrium alongside dozens, sometimes hundreds, of other clients. When his turn came, he would greet his patron by name, pay his respects, and in return receive a small gift. That gift was called the sportula. Originally, it was a basket of food, enough for a modest meal, perhaps some bread, a little wine, a portion of beans. Over time, the sportula evolved into a cash payment, standardized at roughly 6¼ sesterces. Not a fortune, but enough to live on if you came back tomorrow and the day after that and the day after that. The system was elegant in its way, binding the city together through obligation and routine. But do not mistake this for charity. The salutatio was not generosity. It was architecture, social architecture, built from expectation and hierarchy, mortared with the understanding that every Roman owed something to someone above him and was owed something by someone below. The patron needed his crowd of morning visitors because their presence confirmed his status. The more clients who filled his atrium, the more important he appeared. The client needed the patron because without that daily sportula, without the occasional letter of recommendation or legal protection, survival in Rome was a fragile, precarious thing. Each side performed its role. Each side knew the script. And every morning, the performance began again. Imagine it. The atrium of a wealthy house, its ceiling open to the sky through the rectangular opening called the compluvium, the shallow pool of the impluvium catching the first weak light of morning. The walls painted in deep reds and ochres. The smell of lamp oil and yesterday's incense still hanging in the cool air. Clients stand in clusters, murmuring, adjusting their togas, glancing toward the tablinum where the patron will appear. A nomenclator, a slave whose sole task is to remember names, moves among them, whispering identifications into his master's ear. The patron emerges. He greets each man in turn. Some receive a warm word, a clasped hand. Others receive only a nod. The hierarchy within the hierarchy is visible to everyone. It is morning theater. What no one standing in that atrium could have predicted was how thoroughly their complaints about this ritual would survive them. The poet Martial, writing in the late 1st century, was perhaps the most vivid and relentless chronicler of the salutatio's indignities. Born around 40 CE in Hispania and living in Rome for decades, until his death around 104 CE, Martial filled his epigrams with sharp, often biting observations about what it meant to be a client in the greatest city on earth. He wrote about trudging across Rome in the dark, about waiting for hours in drafty atriums, about receiving a sportula so meager it barely covered the cost of the toga he was required to wear. His tone was comic, but beneath the comedy lay a real and grinding frustration, the exhaustion of a man who understood that his dignity was, in some sense, rented by the hour. And then the salutatio ended, and the city opened like a jaw. The clients poured out of the grand houses and into the streets, joining the thousands already there. The bakers, the fullers, the tanners, the litter-bearers, the fortune-tellers, the beggars, the priests, the teachers shouting lessons to students in open-air classrooms because they could not afford walls. Rome had no zoning laws in the way we understand them. Commerce and living and worship and labor happened on top of one another, beside one another, pressed together in streets so narrow that scholars believe residents in upper-floor apartments could reach across and touch the building opposite. The noise was extraordinary. Listen! Hammers ringing against bronze in the metalworkers' shops along the Via Sacra. The braying of a mule trapped behind a cart of marble blocks. A fishmonger calling out his prices in a voice raw from repetition. Somewhere nearby, the thick, pungent, unmistakable smell of garum, Rome's beloved fermented fish sauce, made by layering fish intestines and salt in stone vats and leaving them to break down in the sun for weeks, drifts from an open shop front and mingles with the scent of fresh bread and wood smoke and human sweat. A fortune teller sits on a folding stool, reading the palm of a nervous young man. A barber shaves a client in the open street, his razor catching the light. Everything happens in public. Everything is witnessed. Martial captured this pandemonium with a specificity that still startles. In one of his epigrams, he catalogued the sounds that made sleep impossible in Rome. The schoolteacher's shouts at dawn, the coppersmith's hammering, the money changer clinking coins on his counter. He begged half seriously for the city to be quiet, just for a moment, just long enough for a man to think. But there is a detail in his complaints that scholars have long found revealing, one that reframes the picture entirely. Martial never left. Despite everything, the noise, the indignity of the salutatio, the cramped apartments, the expense, he stayed in Rome for the better part of his adult life. He stayed because, for all its chaos, the city offered something that no provincial town could match. It offered proximity to power, to culture, to opportunity, to the feeling of being at the center of the known world. The noise was the price of relevance. The satirist Juvenal, writing a generation later, painted an even darker picture of Roman streets. He described the danger of walking beneath rickety apartment buildings, the risk of chamber pots emptied from upper windows, the crush of crowds so dense that a man could be carried along against his will like driftwood in a current. And yet Juvenal, too, remained. Rome held its people the way a whirlpool holds water, through force, through gravity, through the sheer impossibility of pulling free. 1 million souls, pressed together on 7 hills beside a yellow river, living the most public lives imaginable. That was the sun has climbed to its highest point now, and the shadows have drawn themselves inward, pooling beneath columns and awnings like dark water retreating from a shore. The heat settles over the city. It presses against the stone, against the terracotta rooftops, against the bare arms of men and women moving through the streets. And here, at the center of everything, the Roman Forum opens like a broad, sunlit valley between the hills, its travertine paving stones warm underfoot, its air thick with the sound of a million negotiations. This is where Rome speaks to itself. The Forum Romanum was not one thing. It was everything. Marketplace, law court, political assembly ground, religious center, all of these at once, layered on top of one another like the centuries of construction that had shaped it. By the time of the late Republic and into the Imperial Age, the Forum had become one of the most densely purposeful spaces in the ancient world. You could buy fish here. You could hear a senator argue for war. You could watch a priest consecrate an offering to Saturn, and then, not 30 paces away, settle a property dispute before a magistrate. The sacred and the commercial existed side by side, separated by nothing more than a few steps and the turning of your head. Romans saw no contradiction in this. Imagine standing at its center around midday on a summer's day, sometime in the 1st century of the Common Era. The light is extraordinary, a Mediterranean white that flattens every surface and makes the marble temples glow as though lit from within. Around you, the noise is layered and continuous, a hum that rises and falls like breathing. Merchants call out prices. Advocates rehearse their arguments in low, urgent mutters, pacing beneath porticos. Somewhere nearby, a money changer drops coins onto a wooden counter, and the sound, that bright, particular clink of bronze on oak, cuts through everything. You can smell roasting meat from a thermopolium on the Via Sacra, and beneath that, the faintly mineral scent of heated stone. The Forum is alive. 2 great buildings dominated the legal and commercial life of this space. The Basilica Aemilia, originally constructed in 179 BCE and rebuilt several times over the following centuries, stood along the Forum's northern edge. It was a vast, colonnaded hall, not a church, despite the name we now associate with the word basilica, but a covered public space designed for the transaction of business and the administration of justice. Inside, bankers and money changers operated from permanent stations, and merchants gathered to finalize contracts. Across the forum stood the Basilica Julia, begun by Julius Caesar in 54 BCE and completed under Augustus. It was even larger, its interior divided by rows of pillars into a central nave and four side aisles, and it served as the primary venue for civil law proceedings overseen by the Centumviral Court. Archaeologists have found gaming boards scratched into the marble steps of the Basilica Julia, evidence that citizens waiting for their cases to be called passed the time playing tabula, an ancient ancestor of backgammon. Even in the halls of justice, Romans found ways to be human. But here is a detail about Roman daily life that reshapes our understanding of how these people experienced time itself. Romans did not measure hours the way we do. They divided the period of daylight, from sunrise to sunset, into exactly 12 equal parts, which they called hori. This sounds familiar until you consider what it means. Because the amount of daylight changes with the seasons, a Roman hour was not of fixed duration. At the summer solstice in Rome, when daylight stretched to roughly 15 of our modern hours, each of those 12 Roman hours lasted approximately 75 minutes. At the winter solstice, when daylight shrank to about 9 hours, a single hora compressed to just 45 minutes. Midday was always the 6th hour, but the 6th hour was not always the same length. Time itself expanded and contracted with the light. Think about what this means for the people standing in the forum at the 6th hour on a long summer's day. Their morning has been enormous, each hour stretching, unhurried, generous with its minutes. The pace of business, of argument, of conversation would have felt different, shaped by a clock that breathed with the earth rather than ticking against it. There were no mechanical clocks in Rome. Time was read from sundials, from water clocks, from the position of light on a familiar wall. And so midday in summer was a vast, lingering plateau, a broad shelf of heat and commerce and talk, while midday in winter was a brief, sharp summit, arrived at quickly and already tilting toward dusk. The Romans did not live outside of time. They lived inside a version of it that was more honest than ours. What no one realized, perhaps not even the Romans themselves in any articulate way, was how profoundly this elastic sense of time shaped their social rhythms. The forum was busiest in the hours surrounding midday, the 4th, 5th, 6th, and 7th hours, because this was when the city's public life reached its peak. Advocates presented their cases. Politicians canvassed for support among the crowds. The Tabani Nova, a row of shops and banking houses along the forum's edge, conducted the financial transactions that kept the empire's economy circulating. Letters of credit were drawn up. Debts were recorded on wax tablets. Loans were negotiated with interest rates that scholars estimate ranged from 4 to 12% annually, depending on the risk. Rome was, among many other things, a civilization that ran on paperwork. And yet, for all its busyness, the Forum was also a place where people simply stood and watched. The Romans had a word for this. They called it otium, leisure, the deliberate and valued counterpart to negotium, which literally meant the negation of leisure and which gave us our word negotiation. To be in the Forum was not only to conduct business. It was to see and be seen, to hear the gossip of the city, to feel the pulse of the Republic or the Empire beating in the voices around you. Old men gathered near the rostra, the great speaker's platform decorated with the bronze prows of captured warships. Young men lingered near the temple of Castor and Pollux, where the steps provided a natural gathering place, a kind of ancient amphitheater facing the crowd. Women moved through the space too, despite what older histories sometimes suggest. Evidence from legal texts, graffiti, and literary sources confirms that Roman women of various social classes were present in the Forum, conducting business, attending trials, and participating in the commercial life of the city. The Forum belonged to everyone. By the 7th hour, the energy would begin to shift. The most pressing business of the day had been concluded. The advocates were hoarse. The money changers were counting their takings. The heat, which had been bearable in the morning, now lay across the Forum like a physical weight, pressing down on the crowd, slowing movement, thickening thought. Romans of means would be, and so the morning deepens, and the city finds its rhythm. Not the rhythm of senators or generals, not the cadence of marble speeches echoing across the Forum, but something older and more persistent, the sound of hands at work. Rough hands, calloused hands, hands dusted with flour, stained with dye, cracked from years of shaping wet clay on a spinning wheel. These are the hands that built Rome, not in the grand symbolic sense of empire, but in the literal, daily, unglamorous sense of keeping 1 million people fed, clothed, and sheltered. Listen closely, and you can almost hear them: the scrape of a baker's paddle against the oven floor, the rhythmic thud of a fuller stamping cloth in a stone basin, the tap-tap-tap of a cobbler's hammer in a workshop no wider than a doorway. This is the music beneath the music. This is the work of ordinary hands. We know an astonishing amount about these workers, and the reason is both beautiful and melancholy. They told us themselves, not in letters or memoirs, but in stone. Funerary inscriptions and carved reliefs, recovered from Pompeii and Ostia, document over 200 distinct occupations in the Roman world. 200 gem cutters and midwives, sausage sellers and architects, donkey drivers and perfume merchants, fishmongers and teachers of rhetoric. Each one a life, each one a name chiseled into rock, so that passers-by might pause and remember. The sheer variety is staggering, a reminder that Roman society was not simply divided between patricians and slaves, but was layered with a vast, industrious, and surprisingly proud working population. They wanted you to know what they did. Picture a street in Ostia, Rome's port city, on a warm afternoon. The air smells of fresh bread and tanning leather, and something sharper underneath, the faint, acrid bite of ammonia. You pass a bakery where a heavy stone mill turns in its slow circle, grain pouring into the gap between the stones, flour sifting out like pale dust. Next door, a woman sits at a wooden loom, her fingers moving with the kind of speed that only comes from years of repetition, the shuttle flying back and forth so quickly your eye can barely follow it. Across the narrow street, a potter leans over his wheel, one foot pumping the treadle while his wet hands coax a shapeless lump of clay upward into a vessel. An amphora, perhaps, or a simple cooking pot that someone's grandmother will use every evening for the next 30 years. The warmth of the kiln radiates outward. You can feel it on your skin. But there is one trade that reveals, more than any other, how different the Roman world was from our own. The fullers, the fullones, were the dry cleaners of the ancient city, responsible for washing, whitening, and finishing woolen togas, the garment no respectable Roman citizen could do without. And their primary cleaning agent was human urine, collected in large earthenware pots placed on street corners for public use. Aged urine, left to stand until its ammonia content intensified, was poured into stone basins where workers would stamp and knead the cloth with their bare feet. Hour after hour, the fabric slowly releasing its grime and emerging brighter. The smell must have been extraordinary. And yet the trade was profitable enough that Emperor Vespasian, who reigned from 69 to 79 AD, imposed a tax on the collection of urine from public latrines. When his son Titus reportedly objected to the indignity of such a tax, Vespasian held up a gold coin and asked whether it smelled. It did not. Money, he implied, has no odor. The Latin phrase pecunia non olet survives to this day. What strikes scholars most, however, is not the strangeness of these trades, but the pride that workers evidently took in them. There is a detail here, one that historians find quietly revelatory, that reframes how we understand Roman social identity. Many working people, including freedmen and freedwomen who had once been enslaved, commissioned elaborate tombstone reliefs that depicted them actively engaged in their craft. A butcher from Rome is shown on his funerary monument with cuts of meat hanging behind him, his knife in hand, his posture upright and confident. A midwife's tombstone from Ostia shows her attending a birth, her skill immortalized in stone. A vegetable seller from Pompeii had herself carved beside her produce stall, the cabbages and onions rendered with the same care a wealthy patron might lavish on a portrait bust. These were not cheap memorials. They cost real money, money that these workers chose to spend not on luxury goods, but on permanence. Think about what that means. In a society where the senatorial elite often expressed disdain for manual labor, where Cicero wrote dismissively of trades he considered vulgar, ordinary workers nonetheless stood before a stonemason and said, "This is who I am. Carve me at my workbench. Show my tools. Let the world see what I made with my life." There is something deeply human in that impulse, something that transcends the centuries. We recognize it instantly, the desire to be known not by wealth or status, but by the quiet competence of one's daily work. The baker did not need anyone's permission to be proud. The organization of these trades was itself remarkable. Many craftspeople belonged to professional associations known as collegia, groups that functioned as part trade guild, part social club, part mutual aid society. Members gathered for communal meals, contributed to shared burial funds, and celebrated patron deities associated with their craft. The fullers honored Minerva. Bakers venerated Vesta, goddess of the hearth. These associations gave workers a collective identity, a place in the social fabric of the city that went beyond their individual workshops. Evidence from inscriptions suggests that some collegia even participated in public festivals and processions, marching through the streets with banners identifying their trade. Imagine it, the bakers of Rome, flour still caught in the creases of their tunics, walking together through the forum on a feast day, visible, counted, known. And perhaps the most telling evidence of all comes from the bakery of Eurysaces, a freedman who lived in the late Republic, whose enormous tomb still stands near the Porta Maggiore in Rome. It is shaped like a grain-measuring device, its facade decorated with reliefs showing every stage of bread production, the grinding, the kneading, the shaping of loaves, the loading of ovens. The inscription declares him a baker and a contractor, a pistor et redemptor. He spent what must have been a fortune to ensure that no one passing his tomb could mistake what he had done with his life. He made bread, and he wanted eternity to know it. This is worth sitting with for a moment. In a city of emperors and gladiators, of triumphal arches and golden statues, a man who baked bread built himself a monument that has outlasted nearly every palace of the Caesars. The marble halls crumbled, the gilded rooftops fell, but the baker's tomb remains, quietly astonishing, its stone loaves still visible after 2,000 years. What no one could have predicted was this, that the hands which kneaded dough would leave a longer mark than the hands which held a scepter. And now the working day begins to loosen its grip. The hammers fall silent in the workshops along the Via Lata, the merchants fold their scales, and across the city a different kind of rhythm takes hold, slower, deeper, like a pulse settling after exertion. The afternoon sun hangs above the rooftops, and the streets that were so frantic just hours ago begin to thin as Romans turn, almost in unison, toward one of the most remarkable institutions their civilization ever produced. Not the Senate, not the arena, the baths. Picture 1 million people, an entire city, pausing in the middle of the day to do something astonishingly simple, to be warm, to be clean, to be still. Rome's public baths, known as thermae, were not small neighborhood affairs. They were among the largest structures in the ancient world, vast complexes of marble and concrete that sprawled across entire city blocks and welcomed thousands of visitors every single day. The grandest of them all were the Baths of Diocletian, completed in 306 CE after nearly 8 years of construction. Their scale is difficult to comprehend. The central bathing block alone covered an area larger than many modern shopping centers, and the entire complex, including its gardens, libraries, and surrounding colonnades, occupied roughly 32 acres of land on the Viminal Hill. Archaeologists estimate that these baths could accommodate approximately 3,000 bathers at one time, not over the course of a day, but simultaneously, all moving through the same sequence of rooms, all sharing the same water and the same unhurried afternoon light filtering through high clerestory windows. 3,000 people, together, doing nothing more urgent than resting. Imagine entering. You come in from the street, from the dust and noise and the smell of donkeys and frying oil, and the first thing you notice is the change in air. It is cooler. It carries the faint mineral scent of heated water, of damp stone, of the olive oil that Romans used instead of soap. The floors beneath your sandals are smooth mosaic, tiny tessellated squares of black and white depicting sea creatures, geometric patterns, the curling forms of waves. Sound changes, too. The chaos of the street becomes a cathedral hush, punctuated by the soft echo of voices across vaulted ceilings that rise 60, 70, 80 feet above your head. Water drips somewhere, steady and patient. You are inside now. The sequence of the Roman bath was a carefully designed journey through temperature. You began in the apoditerium, the changing room, where you stored your clothing in small recessed niches along the walls. Wealthier bathers might bring a slave to guard their belongings, because theft in the baths was so common that Roman poets joked about it. From there, you moved into the frigidarium, the cold room, where a deep plunge pool awaited, its water drawn from aqueducts that carried snowmelt down from the hills east of Rome. The shock of cold water on a warm afternoon was deliberate, bracing, designed to awaken the skin before the slow progression into heat. Next came the tepidarium, the warm room, where the air itself was gently heated by an ingenious system called a hypocaust. Here is a detail that still astonishes engineers today. Beneath the raised marble floors of every heated room ran a network of hollow channels through which hot air, generated by enormous wood-burning furnaces in chambers below, circulated freely. The floors grew warm. The walls, lined with hollow clay tiles called tubuli, radiated gentle heat outward into the room. Romans were walking on heated floors 2,000 years before underfloor heating became a luxury in modern homes. And the cost of all this, the engineering, the marble, the furnaces tended by slaves working in shifts around the clock, was borne almost entirely by the state or by wealthy benefactors seeking public favor. Entry to the baths typically cost just 1 quadrans. A quadrans was the smallest denomination of Roman coinage, worth roughly 1/64th of a denarius, barely enough to buy a handful of olives. This was not an accident. It was policy. The baths were kept cheap precisely so that nearly all free citizens could afford them. The dockworker, the schoolteacher, the freedwoman selling perfume near the forum. Rome understood something that many later civilizations forgot. Public comfort was public order. The caldarium was the final room in the heated sequence, and it was the most extraordinary. Steam hung in the air like gauze. The ceiling, high and domed, was often fitted with a large circular opening, an oculus, that allowed shafts of afternoon light to fall through the vapor in pale golden columns. The main pool was hot, truly hot, heated from below by the same hypocaust system, and along the walls stood large bronze basins called labra, filled with cool water that bathers could splash over their faces and shoulders when the heat became too intense. You can almost feel it now. The heaviness in your limbs as the warmth settles into muscle and bone, the way your breathing slows, the way the world outside, its debts and duties, its unanswered letters and unfinished errands, simply dissolves into steam. The Romans had a word for this feeling, though they used it in many contexts. Otium. Leisure, ease, the absence of obligation. The baths were where otium lived. But what no one who thinks of Roman baths as mere washhouses realizes is this: the Thermae were also among the greatest cultural centers of the ancient world. The baths of Diocletian contained 2 libraries, one for Greek texts and one for Latin, their reading rooms arranged around quiet courtyards where scholars and casual readers alike could sit beneath colonnades and lose themselves in scrolls of Virgil, Lucretius, or the natural histories of Pliny the Elder. There were gardens planted with laurel and cypress, their paths designed for slow, contemplative walking, the kind the Romans called ambulatio, movement without destination. There were open-air exercise yards called palistri, where men wrestled, threw weighted balls, or simply stretched in the sun. Philosophers gave informal lectures in the shade of porticos. Friends met, argued gently about politics, shared gossip about senators and gladiators. The baths were where Rome went to think, to talk, and to simply be among other people without the pressure of transaction. Close your eyes and listen to it, the low murmur of 1,000 conversations blending into a single sustained chord, the slap of bare feet on wet marble, the distant splash of someone entering the frigidarium, the scrape of a strigil drawing oil and dead skin from a forearm in long, slow strokes. A strigil was a curved bronze blade, shaped like a shallow crescent, and the sound it made against oiled skin was a soft rasp, rhythmic and oddly soothing, like a cat's tongue on the back of your hand. Vendors moved through the outer halls, selling sausages, pastries, and cups of warm wine spiced with honey and pepper. The smell of roasting nuts drifted through open archways. The baths typically opened at midday or early afternoon, signaled by the striking of a large bronze bell or gong, and they remained open until sunset, though some continued to operate by lamplight, and now the light has shifted. The markets are thinning, the bathhouses are filling with steam, and somewhere in the tangled streets of the Subura, a door swings open on leather hinges. A child runs out into the alley, barefoot, laughing, chasing a wooden hoop that wobbles over the uneven stones. Behind her, a voice calls her back. Not angry. Tired, perhaps. Fond. This is the sound of Roman family life, not the grand pronouncements of senators, not the roar of the arena, but the small, persistent, ancient music of a parent calling a child home before the light fades entirely. The Roman household was called the familia, and it meant something broader and more binding than our modern word suggests. It encompassed not only parents and children, but also slaves, freed persons, and sometimes extended relations who lived under a single roof. At the center of this complex organism stood one figure whose authority was, in legal terms, almost absolute. He was the paterfamilias, the eldest living male of the family line. Under a principle known as patria potestas, he held legal power over every member of his household, including, remarkably, his adult sons, their wives, and their children in turn. This authority did not expire when a son came of age, nor when he married, nor when he became a magistrate or commanded legions. It ended only when the paterfamilias died. Then and only then did his eldest son step into the role, and the cycle began again. Think about what that means for a moment. A Roman man of 40, perhaps a respected lawyer, perhaps a military veteran who had fought on the frontiers of Britannia, still lived, in the eyes of the law, under his father's hand. He could not technically own property. His earnings, his inheritances, his very legal identity were, in principle, subsumed within the authority of a man who might be 70 or 80 years old. In practice, of course, relationships were more nuanced than the law prescribed. Letters survive between fathers and sons that are warm, negotiated, full of mutual respect. But the legal framework tells us something important about how Romans understood the family, not as a collection of individuals, but as a single, living institution with one voice at its head. The family was a state in miniature. And yet, within this ordered world, children played. They played with an exuberance and inventiveness that archaeologists have been able to trace with surprising clarity, because the evidence is physical, tangible, scattered across the ruins of an empire. From graves and household sites across the Roman world, in Italy, in North Africa, in Gaul, in the eastern provinces, researchers have recovered the toys that Roman children held in their small hands. Jointed dolls carved from bone or ivory, with articulated arms and legs that could be posed and dressed. Miniature chariots, sometimes pulled by tiny carved horses. Hoops of wood and bronze that were rolled through the streets with a stick, just as the girl in the alley was doing a moment ago. And astragali, knuckly bones, taken from sheep or goats, used in a game of toss and catch that was beloved across the ancient Mediterranean. Some astragali were carved from marble or cast in bronze, suggesting that for some families, even a child's game was an occasion for beauty. There is a detail here, one that is easy to overlook, that tells us something profound about how Romans saw childhood itself. Many of these toys were found not in houses, but in tombs, placed beside the bodies of the children who had owned them. A jointed doll laid carefully next to a girl of 8 or 9. A set of knuckly bones beside a boy who never reached his 10th year. These were not discarded objects. They were offerings chosen by grieving parents who believed, or hoped, that their children might carry something familiar into whatever came next. The Romans did not sentimentalize childhood in quite the way we do, but they grieved it. They grieved it fiercely. And they had reason to grieve often. Infant mortality in the Roman world was staggeringly high by modern standards. Scholars estimate that perhaps 25 to 30% of all children born did not survive their first year of life. Disease, malnutrition, complications of birth, the sheer vulnerability of a tiny body in a world without antibiotics or sterile medicine. These were the constant companions of Roman parenthood. To have a child was to hold your breaths. To name a child, which often did not happen until the 8th or 9th day after birth, was already an act of cautious hope. The tombstones that survive for Roman children are among the most poignant artifacts of the ancient world. Brief inscriptions, sometimes only a name and an age, sometimes a few words that still carry their weight across 2,000 years. Deliciae nostri, our darling. Imagine a mother standing in the dim light of an apartment in the Subura, rocking an infant in her arms. The room smells of olive oil and bread. Outside, the city rumbles with its endless commerce. She does not know the statistics. She only knows that her neighbor lost a child last winter, and the woman across the courtyard lost two. She holds her baby closer. She whispers something, a prayer perhaps, to Juno Lucina, goddess of childbirth and light, or simply a lullaby whose words have not survived. What survives is the feeling. For those children who did survive, who grew strong enough to run in the streets and roll their hoops and argue over knuckly bones, a new chapter began around the age of 7. This was the age at which wealthier Roman families sent their children to a literator, a teacher of basic reading and writing. These were not grand schools in the way we might imagine. Often the literator worked in a rented room, or in a partitioned corner of a shop, or simply under a colonnade in the open air, with traffic passing and vendors shouting, and the whole chaotic symphony of Rome as a backdrop to the alphabet. Children learned to read and write on wax tablets, using a pointed stylus to scratch letters into the soft surface, then smoothing the wax flat to begin again. The tablet was both notebook and eraser. It was patient with mistakes. And what did they learn first? The letters of the Latin alphabet, painstakingly copied until the hand remembered them. Then syllables. Then words. Then, gradually, sentences drawn from Homer in Greek translation, or from early Roman poets. Education was repetitive, rigorous, and sometimes harsh. Ancient sources mention the use of the ferula, a cane, for discipline, and the poet Horace recalled his own schoolmaster, Orbilius, as Plagosus, full of blows. But what no one could have realized at the time was this: the literacy that these children carried out of those cramped, noisy schoolrooms would become the foundation of an administrative empire that stretched from Scotland to Syria. Every tax record, every military order, every law carved in bronze began here, in the hand of a 7-year-old pressing a stylus into wax. Not all children received this education, of course. The sons and daughters of the poor learned differently, by watching, by working, by absorbing the trades of their parents in workshops and bakeries and fields. A potter's child learned to wedge clay before there is a place in every Roman home where the visible world meets something older, something quieter, something that cannot be weighed or counted, but is felt in the bones. It is not a grand temple with soaring columns. It is not a marble precinct attended by robed priests. It is a niche in the wall, sometimes no larger than a window box, sometimes painted in bright reds and yellows, sometimes carved from wood, sometimes built from simple brick and plaster. And yet for the family that gathered before it each morning, this small shrine held the entire weight of the sacred. The Romans called it a lararium. We know about Lararia in extraordinary detail because of Pompeii. When Vesuvius erupted in the late summer of 79 AD, it buried the city under meters of volcanic ash and pumice, preserving homes exactly as they had been left, bread still in the ovens, wine still in the cups, and household shrines still standing in their alcoves and courtyards. Archaeologists have found Lararia in nearly every excavated Roman home in Pompeii, from the grand peristyle houses of wealthy merchants to the cramped upper-floor apartments of freed slaves and laborers. This is not a detail about the rich. This is not a detail about the powerful. This is a detail about everyone. Think of that for a moment. In a city of perhaps 12,000 people, almost every family maintained a personal shrine. Not because a priest told them to, not because the emperor demanded it, but because the act of standing before a small painted niche and offering a handful of grain or a splash of wine was, for the Romans, as natural and necessary as breathing. Their gods did not live only in temples. Their gods lived at home. The Lairs were guardian spirits, protectors of the household and the land on which it stood. In the paintings found on Pompeian Lareria, they are almost always depicted as youthful figures in short tunics, dancing, holding a rhyton, a drinking horn, in one hand, and a shallow offering dish, called a patera, in the other. Their postures are joyful, mid-step, frozen in an eternal celebration. Scholars believe the Lairs were originally spirits of the ancestors, guardians tied not to a building, but to a family's lineage and its deep roots in the soil. To honor them was to honor everyone who had come before you. To neglect them was to sever a thread stretching back beyond memory. Beside the Lairs stood the Penates, a quieter presence. These were the gods of the storeroom, the guardians of the family's food supplies, and the inner sanctum of the home. Their name comes from the Latin word penus, meaning provisions or the innermost part of the house. Where the Lairs watched over the threshold and the boundaries, the Penates watched over abundance, over the grain jar and the oil flask, over the simple miracle of having enough. In a world where famine was never far away and a single failed harvest could mean starvation, the Penates embodied something profoundly intimate, the hope that tomorrow there would still be bread. And there was a third presence at the Lararium, one that is easy to overlook, but that the Romans themselves considered essential. This was the genius of the paterfamilias, the guiding spirit of the male head of the household. The genius was not quite the man himself, and not quite a god. It was the life force that moved through him, the spark of vitality and generative power that allowed the family to continue. On his birthday, the family made special offerings to his genius, garlands of flowers draped across the shrine, the sweet smoke of incense curling upward in the morning air. Can you imagine it, that thin blue thread of smoke rising through a Roman kitchen, the smell of frankincense mixing with the yeasty warmth of baking bread? The daily ritual was modest but precise. Each morning, often before the first meal, the family would gather at the Lararium. The paterfamilias, or sometimes his wife, would place offerings before the painted figures. These typically included wine poured from a small jug, incense burned on a tiny altar, food items such as grain cakes or pieces of fruit, and garlands of fresh flowers when the season allowed. The Roman writer Plautus, composing comedies in the 2nd century BC, has a character describe a household Lar who has been faithfully honored with offerings of incense, wine, and garlands. What is striking is how matter-of-fact the description is. This was not exotic. This was Tuesday. But what no one realized for centuries, what archaeologists only began to piece together as more and more Pompeian homes were carefully excavated, was the sheer variety of these shrines and the depth of personal expression they contained. Some Lararia were simple wooden cabinets, portable enough to be carried from one home to another. Others were elaborate architectural niches with miniature pediments and columns, painted with serpents, garlands, and offering scenes in vivid detail. In the house of the Vetii, one of Pompeii's most richly decorated homes, the Lararium painting shows the genius of the household draped in a toga, his head veiled for prayer, flanked by two dancing layers, while below them a great serpent, symbol of protective power and fertility, wins its way toward an altar laden with offerings. Every home told its own story of devotion. Religion, for the Romans, was not an event that happened once a week in a designated building. It was woven into the texture of every day, every meal, every departure and return. When you left your home in the morning, you acknowledged the threshold, the limen, and the spirits that guarded it. When you sat down to eat, a portion of the meal was set aside for the household gods. When you returned safely from a journey, you gave thanks at the Lararium before you unpacked your bags. The sacred was not separate from the ordinary. The sacred was the ordinary, seen with attentive eyes. Even the simplest meal carried ritual significance. The Roman writer Ovid describes how families would place a small offering of food on the household fire during dinner, and how the room would fall silent for a moment as the flames consumed it. This pause, this breath of quiet attention in the middle of an otherwise noisy, chaotic Roman evening, is perhaps the most human detail in all of Roman religion. It was not theology. It was not doctrine. It was a family stopping together to remember that they were not alone, that something unseen shared their table and their home. And is it not remarkable how close this is to something we still recognize? The impulse to mark a threshold, to pause before eating, to light a candle in a window, to keep a photograph of someone we have lost in a place where we will see it every day. These gestures are older than any empire. The Romans simply gave them form, gave them names, gave them a niche in the wall and a splash of wine each morning. The layers danced in their painted alcoves. The incense rose. The family stood together in the half-light before dawn, and for a moment the boundary between the living and the remembered grew thin and permeable, soft as smoke. In time, the old gods would fade. New faiths would rise across the Mediterranean world, and the Lararia would fall silent, their painted figures buried under ash or plaster or the slow tide of centuries. But the impulse that built them, the need to feel protected, to honor what sustains us, to stand before something sacred in the quietest part of the morning, that impulse never disappeared. And so the afternoon light shifts, softening as it falls through doorways and across the worn stone of thresholds, and the city begins to settle into that quieter register that comes when the day's loudest work is done. But Rome does not fall silent. It simply changes its voice. For in this civilization, perhaps more than any other in the ancient world, words themselves were a kind of currency, scratched, painted, inked, carved, pressed into wax, folded into wooden tablets, and sent across vast distances by riders who carried them through rain and dust and the long, uncertain roads of empire. Rome was a city that wrote things down. And what it wrote reveals, even now, the texture of its inner life. We think of literacy as a modern achievement, something that emerged slowly over centuries and reached the masses only with the printing press. But Rome complicates that story in ways that still surprise scholars. By the 4th century of the Common Era, the city contained at least 28 public libraries, institutions that were open not only to the wealthy or the politically connected, but to any citizen who wished to enter. The earliest of these had been established during the reign of Augustus, the first emperor who understood that a civilized capital required not just temples and aqueducts, but places where knowledge could be stored, consulted, and shared. Augustus's friend and advisor Gaius Asinius Pollio is credited with founding the first public library in Rome around 39 BCE, stocking it with Greek and Latin texts, arranged in separate rooms. It was a radical idea that books belonged to everyone. Imagine entering one of these libraries on a warm afternoon. The air is cool inside, thick stone walls holding back the heat of the city. Scrolls rest in pigeonhole shelves called niddy nests, each one labeled with a small tag identifying its contents. The faint, sweet smell of cedarwood oil lingers in the room, because the Romans discovered that cedar oil helped preserve papyrus against insects and rot. You unroll a scroll carefully, holding one end in each hand, reading columns of text written in a careful, practiced hand. There are no page numbers. There is no index. You simply begin, and the words carry you forward, line by line, through history or poetry or philosophy, the way a river carries a leaf. The room is quiet. Others read nearby. Outside, the city continues its business, but here, for a moment, time bends. These libraries held works of staggering range: the histories of Livy, the poetry of Virgil and Ovid, philosophical treatises, legal commentaries, agricultural manuals, medical texts. The poet Ovid, after his exile to the Black Sea coast in 8 CE, lamented that his works had been removed from at least some of Rome's public libraries, a punishment he considered almost worse than banishment itself. To have your words taken from the shelves was a kind of erasure. To be read was to exist. But literacy in Rome was never confined to the privileged halls of libraries. What no one studying these institutions alone would have guessed is that the most vivid record of Roman reading and writing survives not on grand shelves, but on ordinary walls. Over 11,000 graffiti inscriptions have been catalogued at Pompeii alone. 11,000 voices, frozen in volcanic ash, still speaking from the plaster of taverns, bathhouses, basilicas, and private homes. They are political endorsements, urging citizens to vote for one candidate or another. They are declarations of love, some tender, some desperate. They are literary quotations, lines from Virgil's Aeneid scratched casually beside a doorway, proving that even common Romans carried poetry in their heads. They are crude jokes, complaints about neighbors, advertisements for gladiatorial games, and tallies of debts owed. One inscription reads simply, "I am amazed, O wall, that you have not yet collapsed and fallen, since you must bear the tedious stupidities of so many scribblers." Even the Romans grew tired of graffiti. This is a detail that reframes how we understand the ancient world, the sheer ordinariness of writing in Roman life. Shopkeepers labeled their wares. Soldiers scratched their names into tiles before they were fired. Children practiced their letters on broken pottery. Election notices were painted in large red and black letters on the whitewashed walls of Pompeii's main streets, sometimes by professional sign writers hired by candidates. The language is direct, personal, immediate. "Vote for Gaius Julius Polybius, he brings good bread," reads one endorsement. These were not grand literary statements. They were the casual, unremarkable evidence of a society where the written word belonged to daily life as naturally as bread and water. But perhaps the most intimate writing to survive from the Roman world comes not from the sunlit streets of Italy, but from the cold, rain-soaked edge of empire, a place as far from Rome as one could travel and still be within its borders. In northern Britain, near what is now the border between England and Scotland, there stood a Roman fort called Vindolanda. It was a garrison post on the frontier, a place of mud and timber and soldiers far from home. And in the waterlogged soil beneath its floors, archaeologists discovered something extraordinary: thin wooden tablets, roughly the size of modern postcards, their surfaces covered in faded Latin script. The Vindolanda tablets date to approximately 100 CE, and they preserve personal letters of astonishing intimacy. Officers write to one another requesting supplies, socks, sandals, underpants against the bitter northern cold. Soldiers report troop strengths and movements along the frontier. But among all these documents, one stands apart. It is a birthday invitation, written by a woman named Claudia Severa to her friend Sulpicia Lepidina, the wife of the fort's commanding officer. Claudia writes warmly, urging Sulpicia to come to her birthday celebration, telling her that she will make the day more enjoyable by her presence. The closing words appear to be in Claudia's own hand, a personal touch added after a scribe had written the main body of the letter. It is believed to be the earliest known example of writing in Latin by a woman. Think of that for a moment. A woman on the edge of the known world, surrounded by moorland and mist, and the distant sound of sentries calling through the night, sits down and writes to her friend. She does not write about empire or conquest. She writes about a birthday. She writes about missing someone. She writes about the simple human wish to have the people she loves gathered in one room on one particular day, when the year turns and the candles are lit and the wine is poured. Nearly 2,000 years later, her words survive, still legible, still warm. What the Vindolanda tablets and the graffiti of Pompeii share is this. They remind us that writing, for the Romans, was not merely an elite activity conducted in marble halls. It was woven into the fabric of ordinary existence, scratched onto walls by bored teenagers, pressed into wax by merchants keeping accounts, inked onto thin slices of wood by women who missed their friends. The 28 public libraries of Rome were the light is changing now. You can feel it even before you see it, the way the air above the city softens, the way the shadows pooling beneath the temple colonnades begin to stretch and merge into something wider, something that no longer belongs to any single column or wall, but to the evening itself. The sun, which has governed every hour of this Roman day with such precision, is lowering toward the western hills, and as it does, it turns the surface of the Tiber into something almost molten, a slow, bronze ribbon winding through the heart of the city. Along its banks, the last of the boatmen are tying off their craft. The washerwomen have gone. The sound of the water, always there beneath the noise of a million lives, rises gently into the spaces left behind by the fading crowd. Rome is not quiet yet, but it is beginning to remember what quiet feels like. And with this shift in light comes the most important meal of the Roman day. The Cena. Romans did not eat as we do, with dinner arriving after dark at the end of a long evening. Their main meal began much earlier, typically around the 9th hour, which, by our reckoning, falls somewhere between 2 and 3 in the afternoon, depending on the season. Everything before it had been light. A small breakfast of bread and perhaps cheese or fruit, eaten quickly upon waking. A modest lunch, the prandium, grabbed in passing around midday. But the Cena was different. The Cena was where the day arrived at itself. For the wealthy, this meal was an event of extraordinary ritual and warmth. Guests were welcomed into the triclinium, the dining room, where 3 broad couches were arranged in a U-shape around a low central table. You did not sit at a Roman dinner. You reclined. You leaned on your left elbow, your feet tucked away from the table, and you ate with your right hand from shared dishes placed within reach. The room would be lit with oil lamps, their small flames reflected in polished bronze and glassware, and the walls might be painted with scenes of gardens and mythological feasts, so that even the room itself seemed to be celebrating. Imagine the warmth of that lamplight against terracotta walls, the smell of roasted meat seasoned with garum and cumin, the low murmur of conversation drifting between courses. A formal cena among the elite could stretch for hours, moving from the gustatio, appetizers of eggs, olives, and shellfish, through the main courses of fish and fowl and roasted game, and finally to the secondi mensae, the dessert course, with its honeyed pastries and dried fruits and nuts. Time during the cena became generous. But here is a detail that changes how we picture this city. The grand reclining dinner, so often depicted in film and popular imagination, was not how most Romans ate. The vast majority of Rome's inhabitants lived in insulae, those towering apartment blocks with no kitchens, no running water above the ground floor, and no space for a triclinium. Cooking over open flame in a wooden building 5 or 6 stories high was extraordinarily dangerous and often prohibited. So where did ordinary Romans go when the 9th hour arrived and their stomachs reminded them that the day had been long? They went to the Thermopolium. Over 150 thermopolia have been identified in the excavations at Pompeii alone. 150 in a single city far smaller than Rome. Picture that. These were fast food counters, open to the street, with L-shaped masonry bars into which large clay jars called dolia were set, their wide mouths flush with the countertop. Inside those jars sat ready-made food, kept warm by the residual heat of the structure. Stews of lentils and beans, cooked grains, spiced meats, sometimes wine mixed with warm water. You walked up. You paid. You ate standing right there at the counter, or perhaps perched on a bench nearby, shoulder to shoulder with freedmen and laborers and merchants finishing their day. These were the beating hearts of neighborhood life. In 2019, archaeologists in Pompeii uncovered a remarkably preserved thermopolium in Reggio V, its counters still painted with vivid frescoes of a rooster, ducks, and a sea nymph riding a seahorse. Inside the dolia, they found traces of pork, fish, snail, and beef, evidence of a surprisingly varied menu. There were even the remains of a small dog, curled beneath the counter when Vesuvius buried the city in ash in the year 79 AD. What no one had quite anticipated was just how vibrant and colorful these ordinary establishments were, how much care their owners invested in making a simple food counter beautiful. Even the most everyday Roman meal was served alongside art. And so the cena passed, whether taken reclining on embroidered cushions or standing at a painted counter on a side street. The food was eaten. The wine was drunk. Friends lingered or didn't. And then, slowly, inevitably, the evening deepened into something else entirely. The sun, which had measured every Roman hour, slipped below the Janiculum hill, and Rome was plunged into darkness. There was no public street lighting. None. Consider what that means for a city of perhaps 1 million people, a city of narrow alleys and towering buildings and streets that twisted without pattern through valleys and over hills. When the sun set, the Roman night was absolute. The only light came from the interiors of homes, the faint glow of oil lamps behind shuttered windows, and from the moon when it chose to appear. The stars above Rome were not decorative. They were functional. They were sometimes the only thing between you and total blindness. Those who could afford it hired lanternarii, lantern bearers, men whose sole job was to walk ahead of you through the darkened streets, holding a lamp aloft to illuminate the uneven paving stones, the open gutters, the corners where trouble might wait. The lanternarius was guide, protector, and companion in one. His small circle of moving light was your entire navigable world. Beyond it, the city existed only as sound. Footsteps somewhere behind you. A burst of laughter from a tavern. The creak of a cart, for carts were banned from Rome's streets during daylight hours and only permitted to make deliveries after dark, which meant the night was paradoxically louder than the day in certain quarters. But what happens to a person's sense of a city when they can only hear it? When the grand temples and triumphal arches and painted facades dissolve into nothing but footfall and echo, and the occasional splash of the Tiber against its embankments. The poet Juvenal, writing in the late 1st and early 2nd centuries AD, complained bitterly about the dangers of Rome's streets after dark, the risk of chamber pots being emptied from upper windows, the possibility of encountering drunken brawlers, the heavy wagons rumbling through intersections with no regard for pedestrians. His satires exaggerate, as satires must. But beneath the comic hyperbole lies a real geography of anxiety. Night in Rome was not a gentle retreat into domesticity for everyone. For the enslaved, for the poor, for those who worked the late shifts at bakeries and fulleries, darkness was simply another condition of labor. Yet there was beauty in it too. Behind closed doors, families gathered in the fading warmth of charcoal braziers. Children were put to bed in small rooms that smelled of wool and lamp oil. In wealthier homes, the evening might continue with reading aloud or music. The city has grown quiet now, and the sky above Rome has become something else entirely. Not the pale, hazy dome of afternoon, not the amber wash of sunset over the Tiber, but a darkness so deep and so wide that it seems to breathe. From the rooftops of the Aventine Hill, from the upper stories of tenement blocks where the air is cooler and the noise of the streets has finally faded, a Roman might have stepped outside into this darkness and looked up. And what they saw would have been overwhelming. No electric light existed anywhere on Earth. No street lamps, no illuminated windows stretching to the horizon, no ambient glow from distant cities. There was only fire, a few oil lamps flickering in doorways, the occasional torch of a night watchman, and above all of it, the stars, blazing in their tens of thousands with a brilliance that most people alive today have never witnessed. The Milky Way would have been not a faint smudge, but a river of light, spilling across the sky from horizon to horizon, so vivid that it seemed to have texture, depth, almost weight. The Romans called it the Via Lactea. They believed it was the road to the palace of the gods. Rome was not a civilization that merely glanced at the sky. It studied the sky, catalogued the sky, and built the architecture of its entire public life around the movements of what it saw there. The Roman calendar, the very system by which consuls took office, by which festivals were celebrated, by which debts came due and armies marched, was anchored to the stars. And for centuries, that calendar was a mess. The old Roman calendar, inherited from the early Republic, drifted constantly out of alignment with the solar year. Priests called pontifices held the power to insert extra days or even extra months to correct the drift, but they wielded this power politically, lengthening the terms of allies and shortening the terms of rivals. By the 1st century BCE, the calendar was so badly misaligned that the harvest festival fell in summer and winter months arrived, when trees were in bloom. Something had to give. In 46 BCE, Julius Caesar, fresh from his campaigns in Egypt, where he had encountered the sophisticated astronomical traditions of Alexandria, imposed a radical reform. He enlisted the expertise of an Alexandrian astronomer named Sosigenes, and together they dismantled the old system entirely. The new calendar established a year of 365 days, with an extra day added every 4 years to account for the roughly quarter-day difference between the calendar year and the actual time it takes Earth to orbit the sun. To correct the accumulated drift, Caesar declared that the year 46 BCE itself would contain 445 days, the longest year in recorded history, which the Romans, with characteristic dryness, called the Ultimus Annus Confusionis, the last year of confusion. It worked. The Julian calendar, as it came to be known, held its shape so well that it remained the standard calendar across Europe for more than 1600 years. Every time you note that February is shorter than the other months, you are living inside a decision made in Rome, in consultation with an astronomer from Alexandria over 2,000 years ago. But the stars were not only a problem to be solved. They were a landscape to be read, a source of wonder, and for many Romans, a mirror of fate. On public walls and in civic spaces across the Roman world, there stood objects called parapygmata, stone or bronze tablets inscribed with astronomical information, fitted with small holes into which movable pegs could be inserted to track the risings and settings of specific stars throughout the year. A citizen passing through the forum might pause at one of these devices and note that Sirius was about to rise, that the rainy season was approaching, that the sailing winds would soon shift. The parapegma was part calendar, part almanac, part weather forecast, and it connected the most ordinary decisions of daily life: when to plant, when to travel, when to store grain, to the enormous silent movements of the cosmos overhead. There was something democratic about it, something generous. The stars belonged to everyone. No Roman writer engaged with the sky more encyclopedically than Pliny the Elder. His Natural History, completed around 77 CE and dedicated to the Emperor Titus, is one of the most ambitious works of compilation the ancient world ever produced. 37 books, covering everything from geography to metallurgy, from the habits of elephants to the properties of gemstones. But it is in his astronomical sections that Pliny's voice takes on a quality of genuine awe. He wrote extensively about comets, which he categorized by shape and color, noting their appearances with a precision that modern astronomers have used to identify specific historical events. He described eclipses, planetary movements, the behavior of the moon. He was not always correct. Pliny was a compiler, not an original theorist, and he sometimes preserved folk beliefs alongside careful observation. But what no one could deny was the scale of his curiosity. He wanted to hold the entire natural world inside a single work. He wanted to write everything down before it was forgotten. And there is a detail here, one that says more about the man than any of his theories ever could. Pliny died in 79 CE during the eruption of Vesuvius, having sailed toward the disaster rather than away from it, driven by the desire to observe the phenomenon up close and to rescue friends stranded on the shore. He was killed by the very natural world he had spent his life trying to describe. Imagine now a Roman man or woman standing on a rooftop on a still night in the 2nd century. The tiles are warm beneath their feet, holding the last heat of the day. Below, the city is a labyrinth of shadows, the occasional cough or murmur drifting up from open windows, the distant bark of a dog near the river. Above, the sky is absolute. Orion is climbing in the east, his belt 3 bright points in a perfect line. The Pleiades are a soft cluster near the shoulder of Taurus, and the Romans, like the Greeks before them, called them the 7 Sisters, though most eyes can only resolve 6. The planet Jupiter, which the Romans named for the king of their gods, burns steadily in the south, brighter than any star, unwavering where the stars tremble. And the moon, if it is present, lays a silver light across the clay rooftops that makes the whole city look like something dreamed rather than built. What did they feel standing there? We cannot know entirely, but we have clues. Roman poets returned again and again to the night sky as a symbol of perspective, the idea that gazing upward could make the troubles of the day seem small. Seneca wrote that the mind, when it contemplates the stars, recognizes its true homeland. Cicero, in his Dream of Scipio, imagined a vision from the heavens in which the earth appeared so tiny that the Roman Empire itself was barely a dot upon its surface. This was not nihilism. It was consolation. The stars reminded Romans that the world was vast, that their lives were brief, and that this brevity was not a tragedy, but simply the shape of things. The night deepens. The constellations wheel slowly westward. Though the movement is too gradual to see, you would have to look away for an hour and look back to notice the change. Somewhere below, a baker is already awake, feeding wood into an oven, preparing for the hours before dawn when the city will begin again. Somewhere the lamps are guttering now. Across the 7 hills, across the tenement blocks and the temple steps, and the silent courtyards where fountains have slowed to a trickle, the city is surrendering to the dark. Somewhere in the distance, a watchman calls the hour. Somewhere closer, a mother hums to a child who will not remember the song by morning. The bread has been eaten. The prayers have been whispered. The bathwater has long since cooled and drained away through terracotta pipes into the earth beneath the streets. And Rome, this impossible city of 1,000,000 souls, is doing what it has done every night for centuries. It is letting go. It was in the nature of Romans to build for eternity. Their aqueducts spanned valleys. Their roads crossed continents. Their laws would outlast their empire by 1,000 years and more. And yet the most thoughtful among them understood something that their monuments seem to deny, that nothing lasts. Not the emperor on his throne, not the bread seller at her counter, not the child laughing in the garden at noon. The philosopher who articulated this most clearly was not sitting in a marble library when the thought came to him. He was far from Rome, camped along the frozen banks of the Danube, surrounded by soldiers and the sound of wind across a foreign plain. His name was Marcus Aurelius, and during the 170s of the Common Era, in the thin light of a military tent, he began to write. What he wrote was never intended for publication. Scholars believe the text we now call the Meditations was a private journal, a conversation between Marcus Aurelius and himself, composed in Koine Greek rather than Latin, the language of philosophy, not of empire. And in those pages, scrawled perhaps by candlelight while legions slept around him, a Roman emperor confessed the most radical truth available to any human mind. That all of this, the power, the glory, the conquest, the love would pass. Of human life, the time is a point, he wrote, and the substance is in a flux. He was not despairing. He was paying attention. Consider what that means. The most powerful man in the known world, commander of armies that stretched from Britain to Mesopotamia, a ruler whose word could condemn or pardon, build or destroy. This man sat alone in the dark and reminded himself that he was temporary, that the Danube would outlast him, that the stars above his camp had watched 1,000 civilizations rise and dissolve like breath on cold glass. And rather than finding terror in that thought, he found something very close to peace. The impermanence was not a punishment. It was the texture of being alive. He was not the first Roman to wrestle with time. A century before Marcus Aurelius took up his pen, the Stoic philosopher Seneca had composed an essay that still startles readers with its urgency. De Brevitate Vitae, on the shortness of life, was written around 49 CE, and its argument was deceptively simple. Life, Seneca insisted, is not short. We simply waste it. We squander years on trivial pursuits, on anxieties that will not matter, on ambitions that serve no one, on distractions that dissolve the moment we look away. The problem is not that we have too little time. The problem is that we use so little of the time we have. What would it mean, he asked, to live as though each hour were precious? What would change if you truly believed that this day, this ordinary, unremarkable day, was enough? There is a detail in Seneca's argument that scholars have noted with quiet astonishment. He was not writing from a position of detached serenity. At the time of the essay's composition, Seneca was deeply entangled in the politics of Nero's court, navigating dangers that would eventually cost him his life. He wrote about the preciousness of time while his own was running out. And perhaps that is what gives the words their weight. They were not theory. They were testimony. But what no one realized at the time was this, that the daily routines Seneca and Marcus Aurelius took for granted, the ordinary textures of Roman life that formed the backdrop to their philosophies, would one day vanish so completely that future civilizations would have to dig them out of the earth. The bread ovens of Pompeii, sealed under volcanic ash in 79 CE, preserved loaves that were still scored into 8 wedges when archaeologists uncovered them nearly 1,700 years later. The household shrines of Ostia, Rome's port city, still hold the faint residue of offerings, oil and grain and wine poured out to gods whose names we can barely pronounce. The grooves worn into stone thresholds by generations of Roman feet are still there, still measurable, still carrying the ghost of motion. 1 million people lived and worked and loved and argued and fell asleep in this city, and almost all of them vanished without a single written record of their names. Yet the stones remember something. The inscriptions whisper. Walk through the Roman Forum today, and you will find fragments everywhere. A column base, a carved frieze depicting a sacrifice that no one has performed in 16 centuries, an inscription honoring a magistrate whose greatest achievement was repairing a section of road. These were not monuments to glory. They were monuments to dailiness, to the belief that what we do with an ordinary Tuesday matters, that fixing a road is a kind of prayer, that feeding your family is an act of meaning. The Romans did not need their philosophers to tell them this. They knew it in their bodies, in the rhythm of rising and working and resting and rising again. The philosophers simply had the words. And so the city sleeps. The watchman makes his round. The embers in the bakery cool to a soft grey ash that will be swept away before dawn. In a tenement on the Aventine Hill, a woman lies beside her husband, listening to his breathing, listening to the city's breathing, listening to the particular silence that settles over 1 million people when they finally stop striving. The stars above Rome are the same stars that Marcus Aurelius watched from his camp on the Danube. The same stars that Seneca glimpsed through the narrow window of his study. The same stars that shone on the first shepherd who ever stood on the Palatine Hill and thought, perhaps, that this would be a good place to stay. 2,000 years separate their night from ours, and yet the distance is less than it seems. We too eat bread. We too carry water. We too speak softly to our children in the dark and hope that something of what we say will be remembered. We too lie awake sometimes and wonder whether the things we built today will matter tomorrow. The Romans had no answer to that question. Neither do we. But they kept building anyway. They kept baking the bread. They kept lighting the lamps. The substance is in a flux. Marcus Aurelius was right about that. The bread crumbles. The bathwater drains. The prayers fade into the silence between stones. But the act of living, the ordinary, unrepeatable act of being a person in a particular place,